text for this morning, yes, it is rather lengthy, so you may want to grab your Bible. You may want to grab your Bible and turn to the book of Exodus, in Exodus chapter 3. We're going to actually read through the entire chapter 3 and actually into the 17 verses of chapter 4. So in looking at the story of Moses at the burning bush, as recorded in Exodus chapter 3, beginning at the first verse, we hear these words. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why this bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said to him, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up to them out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and with this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites, and they say to them, God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. That is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. Go assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob appeared to me and said, I have watched over you and have seen what you have done to you in Egypt. And I have promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt into the land of Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The elders of Israel will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that he will let you go. And I will make the Egyptians favorable disposed towards this people, so that when you leave you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold, and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters, and so you will plunder the Egyptians. So Moses answered, What if they don't believe me or listen to me and say, The Lord did not appear to you? Then the Lord said to him, What is that in your hand? A staff, he replied. The Lord said, Throw it on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, Reach out your hand and take it by the tail. So Moses reached out and took out hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. This, said the Lord, is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Then the Lord said, Put your hand inside your cloak. So Moses put his hand into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was leprous like snow. Now put it back in your cloak, he said. So Moses put his hand back into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. Then the Lord said, If they do not believe you or pay attention to the first miraculous sign, they may believe the second. But if they do not believe these 2 signs or listen to you, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. The water you take from the river will become blood on the ground. Moses said to the Lord, O Lord, I have never been eloquent either, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. The Lord said to him, Who gave man his mouth? Who makes him deaf or mute? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. But Moses said, O Lord, please send someone else to do it. Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses. And he said, What about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and his heart will be glad when he sees you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouthpiece, and as if you were God to him. But take the staff in your hand so you can perform miraculous signs with it. May the Lord add his blessing to the reading and hearing of this holy word. I don't want you to raise hands, but I want to ask you this question. Have you ever made an excuse as to why something didn't go the way you wanted it to? Or even because you wanted to get out of something? And I am not talking about last Sunday. There is no conversation of what transpired last Sunday, especially during the earlier football game, refs, in looking and seeing those things. But I've had my fair share of excuses that I've made, and even those made to me. Some of them have been legitimate, and some have even been foolish. What are some of the foolish excuses that have been made? When one woman, when I was trying to date when I was in high school, was washing her hair for the 14th time that week. Or when her grandmother died for the 8th time that week. All within a span of 1 month. Those were foolish excuses. Have you ever made an excuse towards God when he's called you to do something? Have you ever made an excuse like Moses did in his encounter with that of the burning bush? Why? Why did you make those excuses? And why were you not willing to just say, Here I am, Lord. Send me. You see, there were two characters that were mentioned in this story. Two characters that were there in the time that this took place, right there by the mountain of Horeb. And the first character is Moses. And we know a lot about Moses. And Charlton Heston has made a great depiction of Moses and that of the Ten Commandments. But Moses was a Hebrew who was destined to become the deliverer of the nation. When he was younger, his mother hid him for 3 months, refusing to obey Pharaoh's order. Eventually, she conceded to partially obey, casting Moses into the Nile in a woven ark, in a woven basket. God delivered him, and he was rescued by Pharaoh's daughter, and eventually taken into the palace to be raised as her son. You see, later on, there came a time when Moses decided to identify himself by his own people. And he refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Because of Moses' identification with his people, it led him to visiting the Israelites and killing an Egyptian. Moses fled then to Midian to escape Pharaoh's attempts to kill him. A chance meeting with a Midianite priest who was a distant relative led to Moses settling down, marrying, and having children. Now working for his father-in-law Jethro, he takes the sheep to the west or the backside of the wilderness to Mount Horeb, looking for richer pasture. I think of Moses tending his sheep, kind of like what Peter did after the death of Jesus Christ in John 20:21, when he said with the other disciples, let's go fishing. Let's go fishing in that way. Let's return to the lifestyle we once were before. From all that we are told, we could hardly expect to see Moses back in Egypt again, and certainly not as God's deliverer. But then he comes in encounter as he's tending the sheep to a bush that's burning. But not just any bush that's burning. A bush that rises Moses' curiosity. Why? He sets out to see a closer look at this bush, and this book is a bush that is not burning in of itself. And there's been so many different explanations, and so many people that don't want to look at it as it being God, and they come up with reasonings as to why it's something else. And I've heard so many explanations, but some people just don't want to give God the credit. Some people want to out-explain God. They don't want to just go to the fact of what God does and that God still performs miracles, whether it be a St. Elmo's fire. It was a discharge of electricity which caused a kind of glow. It was something that the lights, the way that it flexed in that way. Maybe it was a volcano that erupted in that way, in that area. A myth, maybe a twig may have set the bush alight, or a beam of sunlight, or maybe Moses had just gone a little bit cuckoo. He was cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. And so I'm looking and seeing these things. Maybe it had something to do with that. Or maybe a gas plant which burst into flames. Or a billion blossoms of mistletoe twigs. Such explanations of those are not only unacceptable, they are also unnecessary. Why? Because if you look, Moses himself says, he says in the encounter, he says that when he encounters this bush, that it's that of the angel of the Lord. So Moses, who wrote Exodus, says right there that in the encounter, he explains the burning bush right away as that of being the angel of the Lord. But even more specifically, if we look through Old Testament, we don't just believe it was an angel, but more specific than that, it was Jesus Christ. It was Jesus Christ who was speaking to Moses and calling Moses the same way that he's called you and I, the same way he continues to call us. You see, there have been 400 years that the Israelites were held in captivity without God speaking, and without God speaking directly to any person. God uses a bush. And he says, from that bush, you're going to come back here, and I'm going to give you that promise that we're going to do this. But we see several things about God's character in the first several verses. The first thing we see about God's character that we can rely on in our own lives is this, is that he is a holy God. When Moses approaches the burning bush, he tells him, take your sandals off. Why? Because where you're standing is on holy ground. What does that say about God? It says that God is all-powerful. It says that God can conquer anything that we are up against if we are willing to trust him. It also says about God later on that he's a covenant-making, a covenant-keeping God, because he had promised that he would never leave the Israelites, that he would never abandon them. And God was making a covenant, a promise in that way with him. And God keeps his promises. So if God has promised you something, he will remain true to his word. Also, God is a compassionate God. He not only cared for the Israelites when he saw them in pain, he also cares for you. He also cares for you and me. God has not forgotten about you. God continues to care for you. And God will always care for you. And he's also a God that's an immanent God. He's directly concerned with and involved in your affairs. Like we talked about in adult Sunday school class this morning, he's so concerned in your affairs that not a hair can fall from your head unless he knows about it. He also knows that every single one of your hairs is counted. So in looking at that, I'm purposely not looking in directions. Okay? So I'll look over this way and looking in that way. But you know what? It's a way that he's showing that he cares that much. That was actually your son that was actually pointing to you the whole time, Dad. You know what I'm talking, right, Brian? And looking and seeing those things. And that way, he cares so much about you and every detail and every fiber of your life that nothing is too small. Your worries, your fears, your problems are not too small for him. And how many times do we go through life and say, oh, God has bigger things to handle than my problems. God has bigger things in life to handle than the things that I'm up against. He's got bigger concerns and bigger worries. There's a Greek word for that. Baloney. Because God cares that much for you, in fact, that he's got your hair number counted. So when we say God's got bigger problems, we're limiting the immanence of God. He commissions people to participate in his purpose. He calls people to be his instruments. So I ask you today, what's God calling you to do? What's he calling you to do? How is he calling you to serve? You see, it may not be as elaborate in that way of what he called Moses in freeing from bondage the nation of Israel, but he is calling you. He is calling you to a purpose, and sometimes we just try to turn it off. We try to not answer the phone, let it go to voicemail. We try and allow it to be that we're not going to answer the call, that hopefully he will forget about it, forget about us, and maybe move on to somebody else to take that call. So I ask you, are you responding by making excuses to God as to why you can't do what He's called you to do? You see, God had a purpose for Moses. God had a plan for Moses. And in Exodus chapter 3, verse number 10, He specifically tells this plan to Moses. And what does He say to Moses? Look at what He says here in Exodus 3, verse 10. He makes it clear. And there's nothing clearer than a bush that's burning is talking to you. It's something that's going to get your attention. He says, so now, go. He doesn't say, wait till I'm done talking to you. He says, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And how does Moses respond? He doesn't go. He starts coming up with a list of excuses as to why he can't go. And he comes up with the first excuse. The first excuse is found in verse number 11. Exodus chapter 3, verse number 11. And it's with a question. Who am I? The translation to it. I'm not qualified. I tried once before, and I failed. Moses had assumed authority when he was 40 years old. An authority that had not been given to him as of yet. So Moses had 40 years to ponder his failure. Moses had 40 years to ponder his presumption and his consequences. Now when God commissions him to deliver the Israelites, Moses wants to be very careful and not go off incorrectly again. So here's how God responds to him. God responds to him compassionately. God responds to him in love. He says in verse number 12, I will be with you. And the sign will be that you will return to the same mountain and you will worship me here with these people. So what's he doing? God is refocusing Moses' attention from looking at the sendee, which is Moses, and looking to the sendor, which is God. What is important is not the instrument in God's hand, but the one in whose hand the instrument is being held. And what? How often do we say, you know what, I'm not qualified to do this? There's other people that are more qualified. There's other people that would be better at this task than we are. Instead of looking and seeing that if God's called you to do it, He's not calling the qualified. He will qualify. He will qualify the called. Isn't this what Jesus Christ did with us in the Gospel of Matthew? In Matthew 28:20, in the midst of the Great Commission, He goes and He says, therefore all authority has been given to me. And He tells them to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And then listen to this phrase. And I will be with you always to the very end of the age. So if God calls you to do something, and you say, who am I to do it? You are questioning God. If God's called you to do it, He's not just calling you, He's going to equip you to be able to carry out the task set before you. And He goes from that, starting that statement with a you in the Hebrew, to that of a you being plural, of looking as such. So that should be enough. You said, okay, that was a duh moment. I got the dumb moment. I got it out of the way. Okay, God, I got you. Yeah, you're talking to the bush. Yeah, you're going to be there with me. I'm not going to live in the past. I'm not going to allow my mistakes to define who I am in the present and in the future. But what does He do? Instead of saying, okay, I'm going to go, He says, wait a second. I got another question. Question number 2. Excuse number 2. Who are you? It's a bush talking to you. It's got to be God. He says, I don't even know enough to tell them your name. I don't know enough to tell them your character. I don't know enough to tell them your identity. And God responds with saying 2 words. He says, here I am. Here's the words that He says. Tell them, I am. I am is the God who is, that is, the God who exists, the God who always exists. The God I am is a God who exists independently. God is self-existent. God is the creator, but has no creator. He exists apart from any dependence on anything or anyone. He is a God who does not need help, either to exist or to accomplish His will. There is nothing which can prevent God's will from being accomplished. The I Am is the God who exists independently and unchangeably. As the I Am, God is not the God who has anything in the sense that he changes. Whatever he was, he continues to be. And he will be forever. And then he says, you know what, I'm going to reveal the mission to you. Not only am I going to give you that where I want you to go, he says, well, you know what, I'm going to tell you where to go. He says, assemble the elders and reassure them the God of the covenant promise, and to convey God's plan of delivering his people from their bondage, and then bring them into the promised land. And then Moses was told as well to go to Pharaoh with the elders of Israel and request a 3-day leave to worship God in the desert. This request would be denied, and only be compulsion of the plagues would be the king of Egypt to release the Israelites. And finally, God instructed Moses to collect, as it were, the wages the Israelites had earned. This was to be accomplished by asking the Egyptian women for articles of silver and gold and putting them on their children. So he's got it covered. And he tells them, go. And how does Moses respond? Yeah, but, in chapter 4, verse number 1, yeah, but, have you ever done a yeah, but to God? God answers your first sets of questions. You put the fleece out there for God to show you, and then, yeah, but, what if they don't believe me or listen to me? This time the question is sinful. In the past, Moses doubted his calling. Now he's doubting the Word of God. Why? Because God spoke it. How often do we look at things in an argument? How often do we look at things and what it says directly in the Word of God, and our response is, yeah, but this says this over there, or yeah, but this source says it over here. That's a sin. How many times does God have to explain the same thing to you before you trust and obey? How many times does he have to keep repeating the same thing over to you till you're willing to say, okay, God, I get the point. Okay, God, I'm willing to do it. Now, don't get me wrong. I've been hard on Moses to this point. I've been hard on Moses, and I think if you've read this scripture, you're hard on Moses and look at this. Well, let's walk just for a moment in Moses' shoes. Imagine I stand up at the congregational meeting this afternoon, and I say to you that a burning bush talked to me and said, this is what we need to do as a church in 2018. Is there going to be an additional meeting after the congregational meeting? Is there going to be a meeting where we look and say, our pastor's talking to burning bushes? Can't we find anybody else out there more qualified than a man who's talking to a bush? Do we need to call for medical help, for medical support for our pastor? Has the last marble been lost? Has the last screw been lost? People don't understand around talking to bushes, and other people listen to them. So he goes on and he says, you know what? God responds. God grants Moses the ability to perform 3 signs. These signs have an impact on 3 different individual groups. The Israelites, these signs were visible evidence that God had appeared to Moses in the burning bush. He says, when you perform these signs, you will see that God is real. To Pharaoh, it shows as well, and to the Egyptians, that these signs were evidence of the finger of God, and that God is a God that does not mess around. And after these signs, after these miracles, how does Moses respond? I'm not an eloquent speaker. Moses is still hung up about his inability. He claims to not be a gifted communicator. And guess what? This is a piece of false humility. False humility. Why? Because in the midst of Stephen's testimony, in Acts chapter 7, verses 21 and 22, in Acts 7, 21 and 22, listen to what Stephen says. He says, when he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as his own son. Moses was educated in all wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. How often do we stop and not give God the credit? How often do we stop and not do this? I've been guilty as the next. There's time I'll stand up front and say, I'm not a good singer. Instead of looking and seeing, you know what, it's not about me being on American Idol. It's about me singing and giving glory to God. And I confess
confess that there are times that I'll look at that and say, you know what, I'm not the right person to say, well, yeah, I can't read a note. But God's given the different gifts, and we should give him the credit. We should give him the ability in that way with it, because God is going to help you through. And so in reality, the excuse that he's making before God is he's blaming God. And he's saying to God, you didn't give me enough gifts to complete the task you're calling me to do. How dare you, God? Now God's tone, God's response in 11:12 reveals his displeasure and reveals his throne of that of a rebuke. God reminds Moses that as his creator, he fashioned him precisely as he was intended. In Psalm 139:14, here's what I want you to hear. It says, I am fearfully and wonderfully made, and God does not make junk. So if you sit here and say, I can't do that because I'm not good enough, you're not questioning yourself, you're questioning God, the one who created you. So if you stand here in church and say, I'm not going to sing, well, that's not your decision to decide whether you're going to sing or not. Your decision in that way is to give praise to God because he's created you who you are. He's created you with what you've been given. He fashioned him precisely as he intended him to be, and that was therefore fully able to carry out his commission. The problem of what to say is one that the Lord will handle in due time. Sometimes God doesn't give us everything we need to say, but he's going to give us on a need-to-know basis what needs to be said, and how to say it, and when to say it, when to speak, and when to remain silent. So what can we learn? Two things from this excuse and his response. God doesn't make junk. What's the second one? Stop trying to stall your call and go. Anybody else good at stalling? Anybody else good at taking that time? We can find one little other task. We can find one little other thing to get done in that time. But you know what God says? Call. Go. And then verse 13. He's really bold in verse 13. He says, please send someone else. Can you imagine? God's called you. He's answered every single one of your excuses. And he says, please send someone else. One of my favorite songs growing up as a child was, please don't send me to Africa. Okay, and I'm not mocking in any way. I have friends who are missionaries in Africa. My seminary roommate is from Africa. I am a big supporter of New Hope Uganda, which is in Africa. I know our church supports Africa, but you know, my prayer was it's just too hot in Africa for me to go. But we look and see in those ways with it. Moses' excuse was this: that's all great and all, but why not send someone else to do the job? You ever done that to God? You ever done that to God? God calls you to do something, you say, you know what? I'm just too busy. There's other people who have a lot more time on their hands. They have a lot more things that they can get accomplished with it. Why don't you send them instead of me? This is the wrong time. This is the wrong season of life. And look at God's response. God responds in three ways. He responds in anger. The first time we see God angry in all of these. The second one is he said, Aaron along. He says, I've already prepared for that, so Aaron's on his way. And the third one he says is, now get your staff, now get up and go. Have you had your kids ever try and give you excuses why they can't do something? You finally get to a point that you're at your boiling point, that you're at your max, you say enough is enough, and you say, get in the car, and get where I tell you to go, and get there now. I don't know if you have, but I have. So in looking and seeing those things, we look and see that in that way. He calls them. And so in the end, he still went and did what he was called to do. So I ask you this question. As individuals, as families, and as a church, what has God called you? What has God called us to do? And it's time, my friends, that we stop making excuses. That we stop making excuses as to why we can't do it. Because can't means won't. Stop saying, I can't do that, because in reality what you're saying is, I won't do that. Because Philippians 4:13 says, all things are possible through Christ who gives me strength. So what do we do then? We respond with a willingness to serve him. But be willing to respond to serve him, not tomorrow, but start today. Don't make God have to come with a burning bush to call you. But make him come in a way that you are willing to say, here I am, Lord, send me. Why? Because we love to tell the story. The story of what? Of Jesus and his love. Go forward. Tell that story to others so that they too may hear the love of Jesus Christ. Let's stand and sing our closing hymn. Hymn number 444. I love to tell the story.